All right. Last week we got about to verse 16, 15, 16 of chapter 12 here. We noticed this war in heaven, and as we've been talking about heaven and earth, these are not literal being described here, but rather the stage of authority and power. Satan is being removed from this stage because this is all hinging on the end of verse 5. Jesus has come, he's lived, he's died, he's been raised, he's ascended into heaven. And therefore, through that process and the defeating of death, now Satan has been removed from that position of power that he once had over all, even the faithful who had died. And this is why in verse 10, this loud voice in heaven is saying, salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ has come. And certainly the coming of the kingdom goes all the way to Acts chapter 2, but that establishment of authority, when Jesus says in Matthew 28, all authority had been given to him. And then the fact that the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. The fact that all those who had been faithful under the patriarchal law, under the Mosaical law, all of them had died, but they still had sin charged to their account. It had been covered by the sacrifices under the laws that they had been given, but they still had that there. And it wasn't until Jesus died and made that blood of Christ available for forgiveness of sins that they were then actually cleansed and made pure. And now, because they have that hope of heaven, now, because when they are raised from the dead one day, when the end of time comes, now Satan, he can no longer accuse them. He can no longer say that they died in sin. And then now, certainly at judgment, along with Satan and all those who are wicked, on the contrast are going to be these who were faithful unto the Lord, unto God, even under the Old Testament times. And now that those accusations can be eliminated. They can be taken away because now forgiveness of sins is available. So then in verse 11, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. And again, I want to emphasize that primarily who we're talking about here are those who lived under the Old Testament. They overcame Satan. They overcame the accuser by the blood of the Lamb. This goes directly to what the Hebrew writer mentions in Hebrews chapter 9 about how that blood provided the means of forgiveness of all those who were faithful under the first covenant. And then they didn't love their lives to the death, meaning they were willing to die for the cause of Christ. They didn't love their physical lives so much that they were willing to deny the Lord or deny serving Jehovah as they were supposed to. They did not love their physical lives to the death. In other words, they were willing to give up their lives and for the sake of serving the Lord. So then in verse 12, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and sea. For the devil has come down to you having great wrath because he knows he has a short time. So now it's kind of this broad declaration. Certainly the heavens in the sense of how it's being used, the earth and the sea, these are not conscious things. Again, it's imagery being used to describe the recognition that now something has changed. This is a great thing, O heavens, which is the fact of this realm of authority and power. This is a good thing that Satan has been, I guess you could say, taken down a notch. His power is now further restrained from what it once was. Again, not that he had earned it or had somehow conquered God in some way to earn that ability or power. God had allowed him for that period of time. Now, God has restrained further the ability of Satan and the power of Satan. But that also means that those faithful on the earth, those who are the seeking to be the saved of God, those who are seeking to serve the Lord, you need to know what's coming. There is a warning here. And so in verse 13, and I want you to remember that phrase, he has a short time, because that's going to be important. When the dragon saw that he'd been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Keep in mind, at the end of verse 6 of chapter 12, this is the same event that we're seeing in verse 14. which means verse 7 on through verse 13 is kind of taking place between verse 5, with Jesus ascending into heaven, and verse 6. And so you have this period of time that is taking place where Satan has been knocked down, he's been cast down to the earth, but he's angry. And so he's seeking to persecute the woman. Remember how we've been identifying this woman is as the plan of Jehovah. From the beginning of time, even before that, he had this plan established. But from the beginning of time, it started taking shape. And Satan has always been trying to derail that plan of Jehovah at every opportunity. The irony is that everything that Satan tries to do ends up actually bringing about, or helping to bring about, the plan of God. And God did it that way for a reason, knowing how people would react, knowing how Satan would react. Now, though, the temptation or the thought process could be for some of these brethren going through this difficult time is that the plan of God is now being abandoned. There's this war of Rome on the saints. Christians are being slaughtered, they're being thrown in prison, and has God abandoned us? Has God forgotten us? I mean, did the peak of God's plan was it over after Jesus died and was raised and ascended into heaven, and then just God was like, all right, that's it. Good luck. No. This plan of God continues to be cared for or nourished. And just as this 3.5 years or 42 months or 1,260 days, times and half a time. It's this period of time that God is going to allow the Roman Empire to persecute his people. It's not going to be an unlimited amount of time. It's going to be a set period, a limited period of time. That's why in verse 15, we see the serpent, and I think it's interesting, we flipped now, instead of referring to the dragon, we're referring to the serpent. And to be absolutely clear here, we have two different terms in chapter 12. The term for dragon is not the same term as used here for serpent. So we're not talking about just a weird translation of the same term, that it's actually dragon in verse 14 and 15. No, this is a different term. It's serpent. It's the same reference to that serpent of old, Satan, the devil. And so I think it's interesting that we've now switched from viewing Satan as this red dragon, which evokes this power and this majesty and this fear and authority that was on the heavenly stage before. No longer is he being referred to that. In fact, after he's been taken down off of that stage, now that he's been knocked down a notch, he's not ever referred to as this dragon anymore, in the sense of having that same authority and power. Now he's the serpent. And so he spewed out water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. And so you have this appearance of this flood. And this is not a literal flood. But what seems to be depicted here, because we're going to see in verse 17, now something else happens. Now he's going to make war with the saints. So verse 15 and 16, it's as if he's chasing down, he's trying to destroy the church. And I kind of picture all the events from kind of starting around Acts 8, when the persecution against the church actually kind of really picks up. Certainly at the end of chapter 7, we see Stephen being killed, and then kind of leads into chapter 8 with Saul seeking to make havoc of the church. And so you see kind of this effort by Satan to stem this tide of people serving Jehovah through the name of Jesus Christ. And yet everything Satan influenced people to do, which was persecute the church, only helped to spread the gospel. And so through multiple decades, going from at the end of Acts chapter 7, Acts chapter 8, all the way through up to close to John's time. Okay, it was around John's time when this war, full-scale war, began on the saints. Nero is often referenced, but Nero, it wasn't full-scale. It wasn't empire-wide. It was only the city of Rome where Christians were specifically persecuted in Rome. There was not a nationwide or kingdom-wide open season on Christians until Domitian. And so this is part of the reason why, when we get to verse 17, the dragon was enraged with the woman. Well, he can't touch the church now. Now it's spread throughout all places. In fact, multiple times in the New Testament, in the epistles and references to the fact how the gospel has been preached to every creature under heaven. Okay, the known world at that time, the gospel had spread to all the places of the Roman Empire. Well, now there is no containing it. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. Satan can do nothing about it now. So verse 17, he's enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So now we have the reference to that war, verse 17. And that is that war that God allows for this times and half a time, or 3.5 years, again metaphorical, but this period of time which is measured by the reign of Domitian, or thereabouts, all the way through to 313 AD with the declaration or the Edict of Milan, which represents the end of the war on Christians, when Constantine issued the decree that all faiths, all religions, all worship would be tolerated and allowed within the Roman Empire. No longer would people be allowed to be persecuted and it be approved by the Roman Empire to allow that to happen. And so you kind of have this progression of persecution, just as we see in the book of Acts. And then going forward to John's time, especially here in Revelation, as Jesus has already referenced in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation to the 7 churches of Asia, how that some of them had already died under this reign of Domitian. Okay, keep in mind that we're not talking, this Revelation is not being written at the very beginning of Domitian's reign. This is towards the end of the 90s AD. And so this is already in swing. And it's not ironic, it's sad. The sad thing is that even Jesus references that this is going to get worse. You think it's bad now, it's going to get worse. And there's even kind of that imagery being provided here in Revelation that the persecution, we haven't reached a peak here. Okay, it's still ramping up. And into the 100s and 200s AD, it's going to get, there's going to be swings, there's going to be times that'll be relatively, maybe not quite as pointed or poignant in terms of people being sought after and hunted down as being Christians and so forth, but there are going to be periods where it's just going to be open season. And then until finally, when that's brought to an end. Thoughts or comments through verse 17?
I was just going to mention the English Standard in verse 12. It says, here we go. Verse 14. Anyway, it's worded a little bit different where, here it is. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might, and here's where it's different, fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and half a time.
Right.
And then the other part, the last 2 verses, I don't want to make light of this, I'm not trying to do that, but you know how my brain works, I have a visual. And it reminds me, for anybody that's seen Harry Potter, it reminds me of the fight between Dumbledore and Voldemort, because everything Voldemort throws at Dumbledore turns it into something else, like the earth swallowing the river, or whatever. And then Voldemort goes off mad to have another battle later on, And so, I mean, that's a real battle scene that you see there where, the good is winning over the evil and protecting those,
And not just in spite of what the evil does, but utilizing what the evil's doing to bring about that which is good.
Yeah, well, if you make a river, you have a big gorge usually.
Yeah.
But they just open that up and let the river, fall
Right.
into it in this situation. So, turning what they had against them.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that, and we mentioned the fact that he has a short time. And keep in mind that this war that Satan's going to be allowed to make is utilizing, and this is where chapter 13 is going to come in, it's utilizing this beast that's being referred to in chapter 13. It's the Roman Empire, or at least embodied in the Roman Empire. And so it's not that Satan has no more power whatsoever. That's not what chapter 12 is describing. It's describing him being taken down from this perch that he's been allowed to inhabit. And I would even go so far as to suggest including the ability of sending his demons into people and things like that, because we see that gradually taper off after Jesus is crucified and after he's raised from the dead. It doesn't come up very much after that. In fact, I think the last reference to it was Paul casting out the spirit of divination when he was in Philippi, which is why he ended up in prison in the Philippian jailer. So I think that's the last reference we have to any specific event involving demons inhabiting people. There's a limiting now of what Satan can do and how much he's allowed to do. But this short time that's referenced there would seem to indicate that this short time is kind of his last bastion on earth, his last foothold, his last stronghold that is embodied by a world empire is the Roman Empire. Keep in mind, the Roman Empire, not only are they exalting the false gods of Rome and Greece, but they also have emperor worship, Caesar worship. There was an entire sect of the Roman Empire dedicated to worshiping Caesar as God. And in fact, at certain times in the history of the Roman Empire, citizens who were actual Roman citizens had to make an oath acknowledging to some extent the deity of Caesar. And we talked about this when we talked about some of these churches in these places in chapter 2 and chapter 3, where in order to do business with the guilds and with the businesses and so forth in some of these cities, you had to be a part of this process. And some of them refused to do that because of their faith. They would refuse to do that. They would hold fast to the name of Jesus. Because how could you in good conscience make some kind of oath and acknowledge in some way Caesar as God, or acknowledge the gods of Rome, and still consider yourself a Christian? Someone who acknowledges only Jehovah and Christ and him crucified. You couldn't do both. And so this Roman Empire represents that kind of last bastion of kind of the fullness of that idol worship, that false god worship. That isn't to say that nations since then haven't been just as evil or just as sinful as Rome was. But it's representative of everything that Satan sought to impose on man in his mind, that Jehovah isn't God. You worship things of earth and wood and stone. You worship men as if they're gods. You don't worship Jehovah. And so once the empire then fell, in the sense of no longer imposing that anymore, again, as of 313 AD, that was no longer imposed. That war ended, and Satan's final, I guess you could say, bastion on earth, the kingdom that he kind of helped rule, it was taken away from him. And so that's part of what that short time is referring to. He's angry. He knows that one day he will no longer have those tendrils in a single empire that rules the world. No longer will he have that type of influence. That's going to be taken away. Snoop, I saw your hand.
Yeah, this may be taking it a little out of context, but for me, he went off and made war with the rest of her offspring. And then for me, this is my notice. Lisa, sit up and pay attention, because this is for you. On those who he's going to make war on those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast and hold to the testimony of Jesus.
Yep.
So that's like, okay, well, he might have had more power in the Roman Empire, but he's still out there.
Oh, yeah.
And that's my notice right there, that, I have to, I'm her offspring,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
And I better pay attention.
Absolutely. This is part of that in verse 17. Just as I mentioned in our prayer just a minute ago, there are principles established here, which is why Revelation remains relevant. Okay, this isn't just limited in application to the people of John's time or to the people in the 100s or the 200s AD who were also going through this war. This is relevant today as well, because the applications remain the same, in the sense that who is the devil after? I mean, does he really have to try all that hard with people who are already lost in sin? So then who's he really gunning for?
Those who serve the Lord.
those that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of the Lord, the gospel of Jesus that they hold in their heart and they seek to tell others about it. Satan's gunning for them. He doesn't have to try very hard with everybody else. He's got them already. It's those who are faithful to God that he's really trying to, seeking whom he may devour, as Peter refers to in 1 Peter 5. Gilbert?
So now we're halfway through the book, and this pattern I'm seeing more and more that I don't know if I had seen before. I try and picture myself being part of this congregation, and you get this book, which is so much longer than other epistles that apostles were writing to a congregation. So trying to fathom being in the audience and having one of the men in the congregation read what we call 22 chapters of this symbolic stuff. So I'm not going to get all of the details in one setting out of 22 chapters, but here in chapter 12, it's the pattern that keeps happening. I would get in the first reading that every time something bad is going to happen, immediately something good happens and it's taken care of. And whatever the monster is trying to do, it doesn't get to win in. And in this chapter, it's chapter 12, it's 4 and 5. The baby's going to be born and the dragon's sitting there ready to eat it, but boom, the child's taken to heaven. And then verse 15, okay, going to be caused her to be carried away in the flood, but the earth helped the woman. I would catch that in the first reading. There's intervention every time something bad and terrible is about to happen. Something is coming in and helping God's people out.
Well, and it goes to speak to that fact that God is taking care of his plan.
Exactly.
Okay, and this is part of the reason why, and especially here in verse 17, we've been talking about this woman and how that many of the commentators suggest that this woman represented before verse 5 kind of the faithful of the Lord in Israel, and then after verse 5 it represents the church. But what's interesting about this is there in verse 17 he was enraged with the woman, that's the church, and he goes to make war with the offspring. Well, is there a difference between the church and the members of the body? I mean, aren't we the members of the body? There's no difference. And so this is part of the reason why I say verse 17, that woman would probably be better understood as this plan of Jehovah, which speaks directly to the fact that every time you see this effort by the dragon, by Satan, to try to ensnare the woman, who's he focused on? He's focused on the woman. He wants to derail the plan of God at every opportunity he has. And yet, every time he tries, God is either utilizing Satan's actions against him or he's protecting the woman. He's protecting his plan. And that plan hasn't stopped. Okay, that plan continues to be nourished and cared for, even though it's, and remember in both verse 4 or verse 6 and in verse 14, both places she's taken away to the wilderness. Okay, the wilderness is considered a place that is desolate. There's no one else living there. But it's also an idea of safety and security. But it's out of sight. Okay, because it's desolate. It's away from everybody else. It's away from eyes to see. And yet it's being kept safe. And so it seems to indicate that sense in which the brethren can understand that God hasn't abandoned you. God's plan is still in effect, and God is watching over his plan. Now, does that mean that the church isn't being persecuted? No. Does it mean saints aren't being killed? No. But it does mean that there is a purpose. There is a reason why God is allowing these things to happen. It's not that Satan's winning. It's not that the dragon is actually catching the woman and he's going to devour the plan of Jehovah. God is watching over his people. He's watching over his plan, and nothing that Satan or man can do can stop it. Yes, ma'am.
You know, the words "the bride of Christ" comes into mind as you were talking, and so you know how sometimes you can put your name in 1 Corinthians 13.
Yeah.
But if you put, and the dragon was enraged with the bride of Christ, and he went off to make war with the rest of her offspring.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Well, and again, I want to emphasize the fact, again, we refer to the bride of Christ as the church.
Right.
Okay? And I want to emphasize the fact that I don't think that this is being, that it is representative of the church, although it includes the church, because the plan of God includes the church. And so it's to that end that Satan he's enraged with the fact that he can't derail the plan of God. So what does he do? He goes after the bride of Christ. He goes after the offspring of the plan of God, which is the bride of Christ. It's the church. It's the body. It's the members of the church who are being persecuted and being put to death. That's who he's in order, because he can't reach the plan of God. He can't touch that plan now, can he? He can't contain that plan any longer. So now what is his last resort? What's his only means of trying to hurt God? It's through the saints. That's his only means. That's the only thing he can do, is to try to at least cut off all those who seek to serve Jehovah.
Yeah, if there's no followers, then he's won.
That's it, at least in his mind he has. I mean, does God rely on followers for God to be God? No.
I'm just
But,
saying, if
yeah.
there's no one that holds to the testimony of Jesus Christ.
Right.
If we all just give up.
Exactly.
But we also know that Christ was victorious.
Yes.
Over death, and so there's always going to be.
There's always a remnant.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, any other thoughts through verse 17? Yes, sir.
Just a question.
Yep.
Is the plan of God elsewhere referred to in a feminine form?
No. Not that I know of. It's never used in this imagery before.
I
And
don't know how that would jive with the rest of her offspring. How would that jive with the plan of God being the woman?
with the plan of God being the rest of her offspring, he's already killed some of them. That's part of that flood of verse 16.
Right, but her offspring is referring back to the woman.
Right. But this woman was introduced.
The rest of her offspring refers back to the woman. How could that be the plan of God? Generally speaking.
Because the
not
plan,
the church.
because the plan of God gave birth to it, verse 5. The church didn't give birth to Jesus. The plan of God gave birth to Jesus. And ever since the beginning of creation, the plan of God was in birthing pains to produce this Messiah. Because ever since creation, or ever since Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, man had been separated from God. Therefore, this plan of God all along was in these birthing pains to produce this Messiah, to provide a means by which his people can be reconciled to him. And so verse 5, that's not until that happens. But she was, notice earlier in verse 2, being with child. This is the very beginning of this sign that appeared in heaven. This is representative of the beginning of this plan of Jehovah. And she's already with child. And she cries out in labor and in pain to give birth. Satan is doing everything he can to undermine that. And it's until verse 5 that she gives birth to that child. And so again, rather than looking at this, again, and I think it's odd that some of the commentaries suggest that before verse 5, this is Israel. The woman is Israel. And then after verse 5, all of a sudden the woman, without any reference at all, now all of a sudden it's the church. And I suggest to you that a more consistent consideration is the fact that this goes back, verse 1 goes all the way back to the beginning. All the way back to the beginning. Because Satan has always tried to undermine God's plan ever since the beginning. And so then the plan of God then produces Jesus as according to what God had intended. Well, then from that plan then also comes the church, which is made up of individual members, individuals who are the offspring of the plan of God. Just like she would have had offspring before verse 5. All the people who were faithful, Abraham, Moses, David, they would have all been considered offspring as well. But because now there is an active war taking place against her offspring, before that's not referenced. The persecuting of God's people isn't referenced as a war against her offspring before that. Before it, it's just Satan's trying to devour the child, or Satan's trying to kill the woman, try to chase the woman. But God keeps it out of his reach. So what's he left with? He's left only with the physical component to be able to address. And those are the people of God that make up the church. And so I don't have a problem. I mean, again, I don't think it makes a big difference in the end how you view whether this woman is the church or whether it's the plan of God. I'm simply suggesting that it's far more consistent and broader in its application if you look at it from being the plan of God giving birth to these things, because that includes everything from creation all the way to the end of time. And it's not, you don't have to explain, how Israel before was this, and it was pregnant with Jesus when Israel wasn't pregnant with Jesus. Even the promises of a Messiah predated the old law, even predated Israel. So it just feels like it's more consistent incorporating the patriarchal law, the Mosaic law, ultimately culminating in Jesus. It's just a thought. Anything else through verse 17? Question 1. What is being symbolized through the phrases heaven and earth? We know they're not being used physically. They're being used symbolically. We have a sign in heaven of this woman. We have a sign in heaven of this dragon. Yeah, power and authority, okay? Or being taken down away from that power and authority. Notice this woman, it's never referred to that she's ever taken down off this stage. In fact, now she is alone. Okay, before Jesus, and ultimately before this war is made with the dragon, but before Jesus, Satan had been allowed to occupy a very prevalent and a place of power and authority. And now he's been taken down off of that. Now the plan of, again, my viewing of the woman is this plan of God. Now she is by herself up there. She is the only one, because Jesus says all power has been given to me on heaven and earth. He's now conquered Satan. He is the first fruits of them that slept. Because in him, the plan of God reaches its not its end, but its cumulative point, by which now the offspring can come having forgiveness of sins. So that being the case, heaven and earth would seem to represent kind of this stage of authority, of power, that thus when Satan is cast down to earth, he's not literally cast out of heaven. Again, that's misconstrued and it's misapplied all the time. It's that he's taken down now. He's no longer allowed to do the things he did before. Anything else through question 1? Question 2. Who was or is Michael? Archangel. Sorry? Archangel. All right. He's referred to as an archangel in Jude. In Daniel, he's referred to as the prince of the people of Israel, protecting them from their enemies. Daniel, again, that's still referencing him as an angel. It's not referencing him as a literal prince, but that he was helping to protect the people of Israel, people of God, from their enemies. Why are he and his angels being depicted as fighting against Satan and his angels? Verse 2. Or question 2, rather. Okay. So, and again, a lot of people focus on this and they think back either before creation or after creation, whatever, or before God created the heavens and the earth and whatnot, that there must have been a war in heaven. And Satan fought against God, and there was this war that took place. And again, it's ignoring the fact that verse 5 shows the coming of the Lord. Therefore, verse 7, 8, 9, this is happening after Jesus has ascended into heaven, or as a result of his ascending into heaven. And so what's being described here is this victory of God over Satan. It's not literal in the sense of Satan literally and his angels fought against Michael and his angels. Okay, here in Revelation 12. I'm not suggesting or saying that didn't happen at one time in the past. I'm not putting any commentary to that at all. But here in Revelation 12, the reference to this is symbolic of God being victorious over Satan, specifically through Jesus. And now the authority of the angels of God, the host of heaven, has now conquered and put down Satan and his servants. Thoughts to question 2? So therefore, question 3, what's being symbolized by Satan being cast down? Is he being thrown out of literal heaven?
No, it's the main theme of the book. Jesus wins in the end.
Okay. Satan's being restrained. Okay. He's being taken down. And again, not even completely to the point that he is now, even. Okay, because remember, there's still this final stage, I would suggest, that Satan still has through the Roman Empire. Now, he may not be able to directly impact people as he once did, again, whether it was through demons or other ways that maybe we're not aware of. But now he still has his influence, his tendrils in the world, the ruling world empire. But even that is going to be taken away. And he knows it. That's why he has a short time. So yeah, Satan being cast down to earth is representative of that taking away of some of that power and ability that God had allowed him to take. Now he's being restrained, and he'll be even restrained further. Question 4, in what 5 ways is our antagonist described in verse 9? Okay, he's a great dragon, serpent of old, deceiver of the world, Satan and devil. Okay, 5 different ways in which the same entity, the same being is being described. The great dragon kind of illustrates that power and authority that he had been allowed to have. And he still has some, but no longer as great as he once did. That serpent of old speaks directly and identifies exactly who we're talking about. It was the serpent in the garden with Eve. That serpent that Satan inhabited, or however you want to phrase that, because remember how God, he cursed not only woman and the man, but he also cursed what else? Satan? Did he curse Satan? The serpent. Although within that there was the curse as well, or the prophecy that it ultimately would be fulfilled in Christ, that he will bruise, you will bruise his heel and he will bruise your head. But he also cursed the serpent to do what? Slither on the ground on its belly, suggesting at that point maybe it didn't do that, whether it flew or had legs or whatever, but it didn't do that before. But now it's being forced to. All right, so those 5 ways I think are really interesting that we have all 5 of those things being described. And ultimately, if you include all of them here in chapter 12, or another one, the accuser, which is part of the one who makes accusation, or slanderer is one of these terms for the devil and Satan. It's one who opposes, or an adversary, and one who slanders, okay, or accuses. And that's why he's referred to as the accuser here down in verse 10. All right, question 5. In what way did Satan accuse the brethren, and to whom is brethren referring, and how did they overcome him? So how is Satan able to, because notice verse 10, there's no suggestion Satan's lying. He's accusing them day and night. What was he able to say before the kingdom, before Jesus died and was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven? About all those, even the faithful who died under the Mosaic law, who died under the patriarchal law, died under whatever law Noah had and Adam and Eve had. Even though they were faithful, did they have forgiveness of sins yet?
No, he's able to say that they were his. He had them all.
They're mine. And if you raise them from the dead, if you bring about the resurrection now, they're all lost. They're all going to hell with me. Again, not that Satan's going to be in charge of hell. He's being thrown in the lake of fire along with his angels. But they all are going to join me there. Well, now, because Jesus' blood was able to take away all those sins, they are able to overcome through the blood of the Lamb. So that they, for question 5, in what way did Satan accuse? Because sin still existed until Christ died, was raised, and ascended into heaven. Sin still existed even in those that were faithful unto the Lord. To whom are the brethren referring? These brethren are all those who were the faithful of God, going back. And then how did they overcome him? They overcame him through the blood of the Lamb. That's how they overcame. By the word of their testimony, they were willing to live and die faithful to the Lord. Question 6. What is meant by Satan having only a short time?
He only gets until earth ends.
Okay, well, sure. There is the sense in which only until as long as the earth remains, there is that application, and that certainly is valid. Okay, it seems to be limited by this war, this 3.5 years, this 1,260 days. It seems to be limited to that span of time. Not that Satan's not going to continue to be active after the fall of the Roman Empire or the fall of this war, but Satan's only going to be allowed that continued authority and influence for a short time, and then after that's taken away, never again will Satan be able to control a single world empire and impose idolatry on mankind. Never again. And that's exactly what happened. So it would seem that this short time even more specifically applies to that period of time until, again, 313 AD, where that edict was issued and no longer were saints. Where there's this war against the saints. Question 7. What best seems to be best represented by the woman? Okay, we just talked about that, and whether you're convinced that it's the Israel and then the church after verse 5, that's fine. Or as I'm convinced that it represents kind of the plan of God overall, which includes the faithful of Israel and would include the faithful of the church, but it's kind of this plan of God. Either one of those applies. It certainly would be true of either one. Question 8, who are the woman's offspring, and in what way did Satan attempt to send a flood after the woman prior to his war against the offspring? So who are the offspring? Regardless of whether you look at it as the plan of God or the church, who would be her offspring? The brethren, those who are faithful to the Lord, those who seek to keep the commandments of God and hold fast to his testimony, to his gospel. And therefore, at the end or the last part of question 8, in what way did Satan attempt to send a flood before the war? What period of time might that be referring to? Now all of a sudden, Jesus has, in fact, verse 10, what has come? Salvation, strength, the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ has come. Okay, and it's what this that has prompted Satan to then send this flood. So end of Acts 7, Acts 8, again, we refer to Stephen as the first martyr. Okay, even though Scripture doesn't refer to him as that, he's the first one referenced in Scripture as having died for the cause of Christ. Chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8, Saul's persecuting the church. He's making havoc of the church. All the way through until around the 80s, the mid-80s to 90 AD, when Domitian finally comes to power, then it's all-out war. That's when the floodgates open. And it's no longer limited to just Rome or a certain series of cities. It's building up, it's building up, it's building up, and then it's all-out war. All right, finally, question 9. How are the offspring able to overcome? Okay. Isn't it interesting that the same way that all the people of faith, going all the way back to Enoch and Noah and David and Moses, the same qualities and characteristics of faith, do they still apply today? Just as they overcame through the blood of the Lamb, even though it was posthumous, okay, in terms of after their death, they were faithful, that blood, or the blood of the Lord washed them clean of their sin. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, meaning holding fast what God had given them, and they were willing to go to the death, faithful to the Lord. And then verse 17, we keep the commandments of God, and we have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Okay, in many ways, even referring to the testimony of Jesus Christ, all those who came before, did they know that there was a promise of Messiah coming? Did they know that the prophecies pointed to the Messiah? Yeah. So even though they didn't have the testimony of Jesus Christ the way we do, and to a certain extent, both verse 11 and 17 applies to all people who've been faithful to God, no matter what law it's been. Everyone, the same character of faith, of submission and obedience to God, it's always the same, regardless of the law. All right, anything else through question 9? Yes, sir.
Just back to question 4, and maybe you can answer it next week. But
Okay.
if Satan was cursed back in Genesis, at what point did he reassume dragonly capabilities, if you will? He was cursed to crawl upon the ground as a serpent.
Right.
And at what point did he reassume that this war is taking place?
Right.
Acts 2
Right.
time frame. At what point did he reassume dragonly capability?
Well, I'm not suggesting that in Genesis, Satan is symbolic, somehow being referenced to the serpent. I think it's actual serpent, and that he inhabited that serpent and thus tempted Eve. I don't think it was that he simply took a form of a serpent, or that that language is being accommodative. So I think it was a literal serpent in the garden that Satan was either speaking through or had inhabited. So I think on the one hand, you have a curse to the actual serpent to slither on the ground. I don't think that's to Satan. But the other part is that you shall bruise his heel and he shall bruise your head. That one applies certainly to Satan. But we can talk more about that next week. Thank you. All right, we will stop there. We'll pick up with that thought and then move on to chapter 13 next week. Those notes again are on this back table for chapter 13. By next Sunday, I'll also have part 2 of chapter 13 available to everybody.